It was a crisp autumn evening in Los Angeles, the kind where the air carried just enough of a chill to remind everyone that the seasons were shifting, but the city's perpetual hum of ambition never slowed. Ben Affleck sat in a dimly lit corner of a quiet cafe, his broad shoulders hunched over a steaming cup of coffee. He looked older than his years, the lines on his face etched deeper by time and the weight of a life lived under relentless scrutiny. His eyes, though, still held that familiar spark, sharp, introspective, and a little weary. Tonight, he wasn't the polished Hollywood star or the brooding director. He was just a man with a story he'd kept buried for too long, one he finally felt ready to unearth. Across from him sat a journalist, a seasoned writer named Claire who'd covered Affleck's career for over a decade. She'd seen him through the highs of Good Will Hunting, the lows of Daredevil, and the triumphant resurgence with Argo. They'd built a rapport over the years, a mutual respect that allowed for conversations beyond the usual press junket fluff. Tonight was different, though. Ben had called her personally, his voice low and urgent over the phone. "I need to talk. Off the record, for now. But you'll know when it's time to write it." Claire had agreed without hesitation, sensing this wasn't just another celebrity confessional. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a barista wiping down the counter and a couple whispering in a booth across the room. Ben took a sip of his coffee, set the mug down with a soft clink, and leaned back in his chair. "You've heard the rumors," he began, his voice steady but tinged with something raw. "About me, Jen, and her." Claire nodded, knowing exactly who he meant. Blake Lively. The name had floated through Hollywood gossip circles for years, a persistent whisper tied to the unraveling of Ben's first marriage to Jennifer Garner. It was a story that had never fully taken shape, pieced together from tabloid scraps and speculation, but one that refused to die. Tonight, Ben was ready to fill in the blanks. "It started with the town," he said, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights blurred into a soft glow. 2010. "I was directing, starring, pouring everything into that film. It was my chance to prove I wasn't just some washed-up pretty boy who'd peaked with Matt Damon in the 90s. Jen was home with the kids. Violet was 5. Serafina was just a toddler. We were solid, or so I thought. But I was gone a lot, you know? Boston was my city, and that movie was my obsession." Claire listened intently, her pen resting on her notepad. She wouldn't write yet, not until he gave the signal, but her mind was already cataloging every word. Ben continued, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. "Blake came in for the audition. Krista Coughlin, the ex-girlfriend character. It was a tough role. Gritty, raw, nothing like the polished stuff she'd done on Gossip Girl. I'd seen dozens of actresses, and none of them got it right. Then she walked in. Blonde, tall, all that charisma you'd expect, but there was something else. She nailed the Boston accent on the first read, like she'd grown up in Charlestown. I was floored." He paused, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he remembered that day. "I asked her how she did it, and she told me she'd been working on it for weeks. Hanging out with locals, studying their voices, their lives. She didn't just want the part. She wanted to be Krista. I knew right then she was it. And yeah, I'll admit, I was impressed. Maybe too impressed." Claire raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting him steer the story. Ben leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "We started filming, and it was intense. Long days, late nights. Blake was a pro, focused, smart, funny. She'd ask questions, push me on the script, challenge me in ways that made the movie better. I respected that. But there was this energy between us. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't anything overt, not at first. Just a connection. He took another sip of coffee, the steam curling around his face. Jen came to set a few times. She'd bring the girls, and we'd do the whole family thing. Picnics by the Charles River, showing them where I grew up. But I could tell she felt it too. Not that I said anything, not that Blake did either. It was unspoken, but it was there. Jen's not stupid. She's got this quiet strength, this way of seeing through people. She'd watch us rehearse, and I'd catch her looking at Blake a little too long. Claire shifted in her seat, piecing together the timeline. The Town had been a critical and commercial hit, a turning point in Ben's career. But whispers of trouble in his marriage had started surfacing not long after. Ben rubbed his jaw, his expression darkening. There was this one scene, Krista and Doug, my character, in bed. It wasn't graphic, but it was intimate. Blake and I shot it on her first day, which was my call. I thought it'd break the ice, you know? Get the awkward stuff out of the way. She handled it like a champ, no hesitation. But after that, something shifted. We'd laugh about it later, how weird it was to jump into that right off the bat, but it stuck with me. He leaned back again, his eyes narrowing as he sifted through the memories. I started talking about her too much. To the crew, to the press. Blake's amazing. Blake's a revelation. I'd catch myself and think, what am I doing? But I couldn't stop. It wasn't an affair, not in the physical sense. I never crossed that line. But emotionally, I was slipping. And Jen knew it. Claire's mind raced. This wasn't the salacious scandal the tabloids had hinted at. No hotel rooms, no secret trysts. It was subtler, more human. Ben's voice grew quieter, almost confessional. We'd have these late-night talks, me and Blake, after shooting Wrapped. Not about anything big, just the movie, life, whatever. She was young, ambitious, soaking it all in. I was 38, married, a dad, but I felt alive around her. Like I was 25 again, chasing dreams with Matt, before everything got so damn complicated. He shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping. Jen started asking questions. Not accusing, not yelling. She's not like that. Just quiet, pointed stuff. How's Blake doing? You two seem close. I'd brush it off, tell her it was professional, that I was just excited about the film. But she wasn't buying it. And honestly, I wasn't either. I knew I was letting something grow that I shouldn't have. The cafe's overhead lights flickered briefly, casting shadows across Ben's face. He didn't seem to notice. When the town wrapped, I thought it'd fade. Blake went back to her life, started dating Ryan Reynolds not long after. I went home to Jen, tried to focus on the family. But it didn't go away. That, whatever it was, it lingered. I'd catch myself thinking about her, wondering what she was up to. And Jen, she pulled back. Not in a dramatic way, just this slow retreat. We'd talk less, touch less. The kids kept us tethered, but the cracks were there. Claire nodded, remembering the public narrative that followed. By 2015, Ben and Jennifer Garner had announced their separation, a decade of marriage undone with a joint statement that promised mutual respect and co-parenting. The media had speculated wildly. His drinking, his gambling, his rumored flings with co-stars. Blake's name had surfaced too, tied to those steamy town scenes and Ben's effusive praise in interviews. But no one had proof, and the story had faded into the noise of Hollywood breakups. Ben's voice broke her reverie. "I didn't cheat on Jen with Blake. I need that clear. But I let myself get too close, and that was enough. Jen deserved better than a husband who was half there, distracted by some fantasy I'd built up in my head. Blake didn't destroy my marriage. Not on her own. I did that. I let my ego, my restlessness, whatever you want to call it, take over. She was just the spark." He paused, staring into his coffee like it held answers. "I've spent years blaming everything else. My career, the paparazzi, the bottle. And yeah, I've had my demons. But this was on me. I didn't fight for Jen the way I should've. I let something small turn into something big, and by the time I saw it, it was too late." Claire finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Why now, Ben? Why tell this story after all these years?" He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time in a while. "Because I'm tired of the half-truths. People think it was all booze and poker games, or that Jen and I just grew apart. That's part of it, sure. But Blake, she's the piece no one really got. And I'm not saying this to drag her down. She's got her own life, her own family now. This isn't about her, not really. It's about me owning what I did." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I saw her a few months ago, you know, at some event. Ryan was there, their kids. We said hi, caught up for a minute. She's happy, and I'm glad for her. But it hit me, how much time I've spent carrying this around. Jen and we're good now, as good as exes with 3 kids can be. She's remarried, thriving. I'm figuring it out. But I needed to say this out loud, at least once." Claire studied him, the man who'd been a heartthrob, a punchline, a comeback king. He looked vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before, stripped of the bravado that usually armored him. "So what happens next?" she asked. Ben shrugged, a small, tired smile breaking through. "I keep going. Make movies, be a dad, try not to screw up too bad. And maybe if you write this someday, people see it for what it was. Not a scandal, just a guy who lost his way for a minute." The barista called out that the cafe was closing soon, breaking the spell of their conversation. Ben stood, pulling on his jacket. "You can use this when the time's right," he said, his tone firm. "But not yet. I'll let you know." Claire nodded, watching as he stepped into the night, his figure swallowed by the city's glow. She stayed a moment longer, the weight of his words settling in. It wasn't the explosive tell-all the tabloids would have salivated over, but it was real, messy, flawed, and human. Back at home, Claire sat at her desk, the blank page of her notebook staring up at her. She wouldn't write it yet, as promised. But she knew the story would linger, a quiet echo of a marriage that unraveled not in a blaze of infidelity, but in the slow burn of unspoken longing. Ben Affleck had finally peeled back the layers, exposing not just Blake Lively's role, but his own, a confession years in the making, delivered over coffee on an ordinary night in L.A. The months that followed were quiet for Ben, at least by Hollywood standards. He threw himself into work, directing a new project that kept him tethered to sets and scripts rather than the headlines. Jennifer Garner, meanwhile, continued her life with a grace that had always defined her. Raising their kids, building a new family with her husband John Miller, and occasionally crossing paths with Ben at school events or birthday parties. The public had long moved on from their split, distracted by fresher scandals and shinier stars. But for Ben, the past wasn't so easily shaken. He thought about that autumn night often, the way the words had tumbled out after years of silence. It hadn't been cathartic, not in the way he'd hoped. Instead, it left him restless, like he'd opened a door he couldn't quite close. Blake Lively stayed on the periphery of his mind. Not as a person, really, but as a symbol of a time when he'd let himself drift too far from shore. He'd see her name pop up in the trades, her latest film, her growing family with Ryan Reynolds, and feel a pang of something he couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Or just the ache of what might have been if he'd handled things differently. Claire kept her promise, tucking the story away in a mental vault. She'd run into Ben a few times since, at premieres, industry dinners, and he'd always give her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret. She wondered if he'd ever greenlight its release, or if it'd stay a private reckoning between them. Either way, she respected his trust, even as her writer's instinct itched to put it on paper. For Ben, life marched on. His kids were growing up, Violet heading to college, Serafina navigating high school, Sam still young enough to keep him grounded. He and Jen had found a rhythm, a co-parenting dance that worked despite the history. He'd cleaned up his act, mostly. Less drinking, more therapy, a conscious effort to be present. But the shadow of the town lingered, a quiet reminder of a chapter he couldn't rewrite. One spring afternoon, he found himself back in Boston, walking the streets where it all began. The city had changed. New buildings, new faces, but the bones were the same. He passed the house he'd pointed out to Blake all those years ago, the one near Matt Damon's old apartment. A laugh escaped him, dry and self-aware, as he remembered her shock. "You know Jason Bourne?" It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme, but it had stuck with him, a pinprick of light in the haze of that time. He stopped at a bench by the river, the water glinting under the sun. For the first time in a while, he let himself think about Jen, not as his ex-wife, but as the woman who'd stood by him through the chaos. He'd hurt her, not with a grand betrayal, but with 1,000 tiny cuts of distraction and distance. Blake had been the catalyst, sure, but the fault was his. He knew that now, more clearly than ever. His phone buzzed, a text from Claire. Still holding on to that story. "You good?" He stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "Yeah, maybe it's time." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then pocketed the phone and looked out at the river. The weight didn't lift, not entirely, but it shifted, lighter, somehow, like a burden he'd finally learned to carry. Across the country, Claire smiled at her screen. She'd wait for his final word, but she knew the story was ready when he was. It wouldn't be a bombshell, wouldn't topple empires or reignite old feuds. It'd be quieter than that. A man's honest accounting of a marriage lost, a moment misstepped, and the slow road back to himself. And in its quiet, it'd be louder than any headline ever could. Ben sat still on the bench, the river's gentle current holding his gaze. The air was warm, laced with the scent of blooming trees and the faint hum of traffic in the distance. He felt the phone in his pocket, its weight a small anchor to the moment he'd just committed to. Telling Claire, maybe it's time, wasn't a full yes, but it was a crack in the dam he'd built around that part of his life. He wasn't sure what came next, only that the words he'd spoken in that cafe months ago were no longer content to stay locked away. The river reflected the sky, a soft blue streaked with wisps of cloud. He thought about how Jen used to love days like this, how they'd take the kids to the park, Violet toddling ahead while Serafina clung to his leg. Those memories felt distant now, not because they'd faded, but because he'd spent so long burying them under layers of guilt. Blake's face flickered in his mind again. Not the polished star of today, but the younger version, all sharp wit and unguarded laughter, sitting across from him in a Boston diner after a long shoot. He shifted on the bench, the wood creaking under him. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, oblivious to the man wrestling with his past a few feet away. Ben envied that anonymity for a moment, the freedom to move through the world without a spotlight. He'd chosen this life, though, craved it, even, and with it came the baggage. Blake had been part of that baggage, not because she'd sought it, but because he'd let her become it. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and he closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. He could still hear Jen's voice from those early days of strain, soft but edged with something he hadn't wanted to name. "You're different lately," she'd said once, standing in their kitchen while the kids slept upstairs. He'd deflected, blamed the film, the pressure. She'd nodded, but her eyes had said she knew better. That was Jen, never one to push too hard, but always seeing more than he wanted her to. He opened his eyes, the river still there, steady and unchanging. Blake hadn't been the villain in that story, he reminded himself. She'd just been there. Young, magnetic, a mirror to a part of himself he'd forgotten. He'd cast her in a role she hadn't auditioned for, not Krista Coughlin, but something more personal, more dangerous. It was his projection, his failing, not hers. A duck glided across the water, leaving a faint ripple in its wake. He watched it, his mind drifting to the nights he'd stayed late on set, telling himself it was about the work. Blake would linger too, not always, but enough. They'd talk about the scenes, the characters, and then it'd veer. Music they liked, stories from their pasts. She'd told him once about growing up in California, the chaos of a big family, and he'd laughed, picturing her as the scrappy kid she described. It was harmless, he'd told himself then. Just talk. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping a restless rhythm. He wondered what Jen had seen in those moments she'd visited the set. Had it been the way he'd leaned in when Blake spoke? The way his laugh came easier around her? He hadn't noticed it himself, not until later, when the distance with Jen had grown too wide to ignore. She'd never confronted him about it, not directly. That wasn't her style. But the silence had said enough. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass. He thought about calling Claire back, telling her to hold off, but he didn't move. The story was out there now, even if just between them. It felt real in a way it hadn't before, like a weight he'd carried in his chest had shifted to his shoulders, still heavy, but easier to bear. He didn't know if he'd ever let it go public, but saying it aloud had changed something. A kid on a scooter zipped by, his laughter cutting through the quiet. Ben smiled faintly, thinking of Sam at that age. Fearless, loud, a whirlwind of energy. He'd been a distracted dad back then, too caught up in his own head to see what he was risking. Blake had been a symptom, not the disease. The real problem had been him, his need to chase something he couldn't define, even when he had everything he'd ever wanted at home. He pulled his phone out, scrolling to Claire's text again. "Yeah, maybe it's time." The words stared back at him, simple but loaded. He could picture her at her desk, that notepad still blank, waiting for his green light. She'd write it fair, he knew that. No sensationalism, just the truth as he'd laid it out. It wouldn't absolve him, but it might explain him, at least a little. The duck had disappeared, the river smooth again. He wondered what Blake would think if she ever read it. Would she be surprised? Angry? Indifferent? She'd moved on so completely. Married, a mom, a star in her own right. He didn't resent that. If anything, it made him feel smaller, like he'd been clinging to a ghost while she'd built a life. A couple walked by, hand in hand, their voices a low murmur. He watched them, a pang of something sharp in his chest. He and Jen had been like that once, easy, connected. He'd let it slip away, not all at once, but in pieces, and Blake had been one of those pieces. He didn't hate her for it. He couldn't. She'd just been herself, and he'd been the one who'd lost his footing. The sky was turning orange now, the day edging toward dusk. He stood, stretching his legs, the bench creaking again as he rose. The river kept flowing, indifferent to his thoughts. He liked that about it, its constancy, its refusal to judge. He'd spent too long judging himself, maybe, or not enough. Either way, he was here now, still figuring it out. He shoved his hands in his pockets, the phone a quiet presence against his hip. Claire would wait, he knew. She wouldn't push. That was why he'd chosen her. Her patience, her steadiness. He'd tell her soon, one way or another. For now, he just needed this. The river, the air, the space to sit with it all. A bird called from somewhere across the water, sharp and clear. He looked up, scanning the trees, but didn't see it. It didn't matter. The sound was enough, a small jolt pulling him out of his head. He'd been in there too long, replaying the same scenes, the same mistakes. Maybe it was time to let them breathe. He took a step toward the path, then stopped, glancing back at the bench. It felt like a marker now, a place where he'd crossed some invisible line. Not a finish, not a start, just a shift. He'd told the story once to Claire, and now he'd told himself again here. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was something. The couple was gone, the jogger too. It was just him and the river now, the city a distant hum. He thought about Jen one more time, not with guilt, but with a quiet gratitude. She'd carried them through the worst of it, kept their kids whole when he couldn't. He owed her that much, at least, to own this, even if she never asked him to. He started walking, the gravel crunching under his boots. The story wasn't done, not really. It lived in him, in Claire's memory, in the spaces between what he'd said and what he hadn't. But for now, it was enough to know it was there, waiting. He'd decide soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. Until then, he'd keep moving, one step at a time, the river fading behind him. The air felt cooler now, the sun's last rays slipping below the horizon. Ben kept his pace steady, hands still in his pockets, the rhythm of his steps a quiet counterpoint to the thoughts swirling in his head. The crunch of gravel was a small comfort, grounding him in the here and now. He didn't look back at the bench, but he could feel its presence, a silent witness to the moment he'd let the story settle into something tangible. A street lamp flickered on ahead, casting a soft pool of light across the path. He watched it, his mind drifting to the way Jen used to tease him about his brooding, how she'd call him Sad Affleck long before it became a meme. She'd always had a way of cutting through his heaviness with a smile, a lightness he hadn't appreciated enough. Blake had been different, her energy sharper, more electric. He'd been drawn to that, maybe too much. He passed a tree, its branches swaying slightly in the breeze. The leaves rustled, a sound that reminded him of late nights on the town set, when the crew had packed up and it was just him and Blake, the city quiet around them. He could still see her sitting cross-legged on a folding chair, script in hand, her hair catching the glow of a streetlight. She'd been so alive then, so present. He'd envied that, he realized now. Her ease, her hunger for the work. His breath fogged faintly in the air, a reminder of the season's shift. He thought about calling Jen, not to confess this all over again, but just to hear her voice. They talked often enough, logistics, the kids, but this would have been different. He wouldn't, though. She didn't need his baggage, not anymore. She'd moved on, and he was trying to, in his own messy way. The path curved slightly, the river still visible through the trees. He stopped for a moment, looking out at it again. The water was darker now, reflecting the deepening sky. He wondered what Blake would say if she knew he was here, picking apart those months they'd spent together. She'd probably laugh, tell him he was overthinking it. She'd always had that knack, cutting through the noise with a quip or a shrug. He rubbed his hands together, the chill seeping into his fingers. The phone in his pocket felt heavier now, Claire's text a quiet pressure. He could picture her waiting, not impatient, just ready. She'd known him long enough to sense when he was on the edge of something. He trusted her with this, more than he trusted himself sometimes. She'd keep it safe until he was sure. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance, sharp and fleeting. He flinched slightly, then relaxed, the sound pulling him back to the moment. He'd spent too much time in his head today, replaying scenes he couldn't change. Blake laughing at his terrible Boston accent impression. Jen watching him from the sidelines, her silence louder than words. The kids running around set, oblivious to the tension he was carrying. He started walking again, the gravel steady underfoot. The story wasn't about Blake, not really. It was about him, his choices, his failures, the way he'd let himself drift. She'd just been the spark, like he'd told Claire. But sparks don't burn alone. He'd fed it, let it grow, and that was on him. He owned it now, even if no one else ever knew. The lamp ahead buzzed faintly, its light steady now. He thought about the kids, Violet's college applications, Seraphina's art projects, Sam's soccer games. They were his anchor, always had been. Jen had made sure of that, even when he'd been too lost to see it. He'd been a better dad since the split, he liked to think, more present, more intentional. Maybe that was the silver lining. He paused again, leaning against a low railing by the path. The river was a black ribbon now, the last of the daylight gone. He could feel the weight of the day settling in, his legs tired, his mind heavy but not overwhelmed. Telling Claire had been the right move, he decided. It wasn't about unloading it on the world, not yet. It was about letting it exist outside himself, even just for a moment. A leaf skittered across the path, caught in a gust. He watched it, a small smile tugging at his lips. Blake had once told him he was too serious, that he needed to lighten up. She'd been half joking, but he'd carried it with him, a little jab that stuck. Jen had said the opposite, that his seriousness was what made him good at what he did. They'd both been right, in their way. He straightened, the railing cool under his palms. The story wasn't finished, not in his head or on Claire's page. It was still raw, still shifting. He didn't know if he'd ever let it go fully public. Maybe it'd stay between them, a quiet truth no one else needed. But saying it had changed something, loosened a knot he hadn't realized was so tight. The breeze picked up, tugging at his jacket. He zipped it higher, glancing back toward the bench one last time. It was out of sight now, swallowed by the dusk, but he could still feel it there, a marker of this strange, still moment. He didn't need to sit again, didn't need to linger. He'd said what he needed to, for now. He turned back to the path, the gravel crunching again as he moved. The kids would be waiting. Maybe not tonight, but soon. He'd call them tomorrow, check in. Jen too, maybe. Not about this, just about life. He owed them that much, his presence, his focus. Blake was a memory now, a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. The lamp's light faded behind him, another flickering on ahead. He thought about Claire one more time, her steady patience. She'd write it well when the time came. He trusted her to see him, not the myth or the meme, but the man. That was enough for now, knowing it was in her hands, waiting for his word. A dog barked somewhere nearby, a sharp sound that echoed briefly. He didn't look for it, just kept walking, the rhythm of his steps steady. The river was still there, out of sight but present, a quiet companion to his thoughts. He didn't need to see it to know it was flowing, just like he didn't need to say more to know the story was real. He passed another tree, its branches bare against the sky. The air was crisp, clean, a faint promise of spring beneath the chill. He breathed it in, letting it fill his lungs. The weight was still there. Blake, Jen, the years, but it wasn't crushing him. It was just part of him, like the gravel under his boots, the river at his side. The path stretched on, dark now but familiar. He knew where it led, back to the city, back to his life. He'd get there eventually, no rush. For now he was here, walking, the story alive in his chest, in Claire's memory, in the space between them. It was enough. The gravel continued its steady crunch beneath his boots, a sound that felt almost meditative now. Ben kept his eyes forward, the faint glow of distant streetlights guiding him through the dusk. The air was sharp against his face, but he welcomed it, letting it keep him present. His hands stayed in his pockets, the phone a quiet reminder of the choice he'd made, or hadn't quite made yet. A branch snapped somewhere off the path, a small crack in the stillness. He didn't turn, didn't need to. It was just the world moving around him, indifferent to the weight he carried. He thought about Jen again, her face flickering in his mind, not angry, not sad, just steady. She'd always been the steady one, even when he'd been anything but. Blake had been the opposite, bright, unpredictable, a flare he'd chased without thinking. He passed a signpost, its words too shadowed to read. It didn't matter. He knew this stretch of the riverfront by heart. He'd walked it as a kid, then later with Matt, dreaming up stories that would eventually become their ticket out. Now it was just him, older, quieter, carrying a different kind of story, one he hadn't scripted, one he couldn't direct his way out of. The breeze stirred again, tugging at his hair. He thought about the way Blake used to tilt her head when she listened, like she was really hearing him. It had felt good, that attention, too good maybe. Jen had listened too, but differently, with a patience that didn't demand anything back. He'd taken that for granted, he saw now, let it fade into the background while he chased something shinier. His steps slowed for a moment, the gravel quieting under his weight. He glanced to his left, where the river hid behind a line of trees. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, its pull, its persistence. It was like the story itself, flowing beneath the surface, waiting for him to decide its course. He'd told Claire enough to set it free, but not enough to let it go entirely. A faint rustle came from the bushes, maybe a squirrel or a bird settling in for the night. He smiled slightly, the sound a small tether to the world outside his head. He wondered what Claire was doing right now, probably at home, her notepad still blank, her phone nearby in case he texted again. She'd wait, he knew. She always had. He started moving again, the crunch resuming. The kids crossed his mind. Violet's voice on the phone last week, sharp and grown-up. Seraphina's latest drawing pinned to his fridge. Sam's grin after scoring a goal. They were his why, his reason to keep going even when he didn't feel like it. Jen had given him that, and he'd almost lost it chasing shadows. The path dipped slightly, a familiar curve he'd forgotten until now. He adjusted his stride, the gravel shifting underfoot. Blake's laugh echoed in his memory again, bright and unforced, from one of those late-night talks. He didn't push it away this time, just let it sit there, a piece of the past he didn't need to fight. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about what he'd made of it. A light flickered ahead, another lamp coming to life. He watched it, its glow soft against the dark. He thought about the cafe with Claire, the way the words had spilled out over coffee. It had felt right, saying it aloud, even if it hadn't fixed anything. The story wasn't a cure, it was a mirror, showing him what he'd been too stubborn to see. He flexed his fingers in his pockets, the cold biting at his knuckles. Jen's face came back, not from the end, but from the beginning, when they'd been new, laughing over takeout in a cramped apartment. He'd loved her then, fully, without the clutter of fame or doubt. Blake had never gotten that part of him. She'd met him later, when he was already fraying. The trees thinned, the river peeking through again. He stopped, just for a second, watching the water catch the last of the light. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a quiet he envied. He'd complicated everything back then. His marriage, his work, himself. Blake had been a symptom, not the cause, but he'd let her become the story anyway.